Hello and welcome to this session on club governance structures with the Scottish Sports Association. I'm delighted to be providing this by recording as well for those that aren't able to be present at today's session. So we'd very much ask that our members and our wider governing body network not only hopefully find this of value, but then share this with your wider clubs to try and make sure that everybody gets the support that they need in this very important area. So delighted to have with us today two absolute experts in this area. So we've got Judith Turbyne, who is Head of Engagement at OSCR, the charity regulator, and Danny Bisland, who's the National Club Grow Manager at the Scottish FA. So huge thanks to you both for joining us and for giving up your time today, and really looking forward to it. So we'll hear from you both and then there'll be the opportunity for questions at the end. So I'll let you both introduce yourselves just before you each speak, if that's okay. So Jude, I think you're going to go first, if that's okay.
Good. I was going to say good morning. The day's gone very fast today, but good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. I would much rather be sitting in a room with you all. That would be lovely, having a nice cup of coffee and a biscuit. But it is great to be able to take these opportunities to talk to a wider audience. And actually, as an aside, I think there's a bit of a benefit going on at the moment that we're actually able to talk to slightly wider audiences, because people who can't normally get to meetings can actually sit down in their home and join in. So there are some very, very, very tiny benefits to the situation at the moment. I'm Head of Engagement at the Scottish Charity Regulator. I've been there rather longer than I thought I would be, but it's a great job. It's a great place to work in terms of being able to talk to lots of organisations across Scotland, both charities and actually non-charities very often. And it is my job to really try and share a bit the understanding of who the regulator is, try to listen to the problems that are out there, try to put guidance out, try to put policy out that's helpful for the charity sector. And I was asked today to talk a little bit just about legal structures, legal forms, and so on. But it would be remiss of me. So there are charities sitting around this virtual table, but there's people who are not charities. So just to start off with just a tiny little introduction to who we are and what it is that we try to do. I promise I won't take too long. We've actually just written a new corporate plan, but it doesn't change very much. I think our vision now is a trusted and respected charity sector which is positively contributing to society. But what it is, what's our role really? Our role is to try to support the charity sector to be as trustworthy as possible, so that public can trust them, so that money keeps coming into the sector. So we are very much in a symbiotic relationship with the charity sector, making sure that we are supporting the charity sector to be as good as it can be. And that is how we try to do our work. We try to be enabling as possible, as supportive as possible, and make sure that we are talking as clearly as possible to the sector we regulate. It's probably quite important to hear this. I say it very often, but the sector in Scotland is made up of many, many small organisations. Of the almost 25,000 charities we have, over 50% have an income of less than 25,000. So we're talking very, very small organisations. So therefore, we really must speak clearly. We must try to listen to what people are saying, and we must try to be as supportive as possible so that we have a strong charity sector who has a fighting chance of getting governance right and getting and doing what it is they need to do to be a charity. It's worth saying a little bit about what does it mean to be a charity in Scotland. The first thing to say about that is that it's important to understand that in Scotland there's a comprehensive charity register. So once you have decided to be a charity, you have to pass a charity test. You will be on the charity register. It doesn't matter how small you are, how big you are, you will be on that charity register. And it's a great tool for transparency across Scotland. It's actually now a very, very well used resource with almost 50,000 searches every month on the register looking at what it is that charities are doing. So what does it mean to pass the charity test in Scotland? Well, there's lots of complexity around it, but there's two main things that you need to be able to see. One is that you only have charitable purposes, and the purposes are outlined in our Act. And it's not enough to have some charitable purposes and lots of other things going on. You must only have charitable purposes. That's a key thing for a charity in Scotland. And the other thing is you must be providing public benefit. Now, that can be in Scotland, it can be elsewhere, but you must be providing public benefit. Now, we have to weigh that up a little bit about whether there's any disbenefit, about whether there's any restriction or undue restriction, it's called. But generally, these are the main things we think about when whether we're looking at whether or not an organisation can be on the charity register. And clearly for sports clubs, it's generally quite easy because that's a charitable purpose, and it's relatively easy for them to pass the charity test as long as they are providing public benefit and as long as there's no undue restriction, etc., etc., etc. So that's what it means to be a charity in Scotland. And I think sometimes there's an interesting debate to be had, because you can provide public benefit in many ways and you do not have to be a charity to do so. And you will know with lots of your memberships, you may have voluntary organisations that have organised to do something very good in their community, but they may not need to be a charity, they may not want to be a charity, but yet they're providing public benefit. Why would you want to become a charity? There's something about sometimes the charity the charity badge. Sometimes there's something around funding, and that's something that is becoming increasingly the case, where some funders look to the charity register as part of their due diligence of who they're going to fund and who they're not going to fund. So there's some reasons why you might want to become a charity. Well, there's many reasons why you might want to become a charity. But it's not to say you can't do good work without being a charity, because many, many voluntary organisations do a great deal of work in many, many areas of society, but particularly in sport, who are not charities. So I just wanted to say that to start off with. Moving on to the next slide and thinking a bit about what are the fundamentals. What does it mean for you to be a charity? What does it mean for an organisation? Now, we could talk about this all day. And as I said, I'm not going to talk too long, but there's some fundamentals of charity law that are quite important to understand. The people who are in management and control of charities are the charity trustees, the trustee board that sits at the top of a charity. Those trustees have collective responsibility, and that's quite an important thing. No one person on that board is more important than anybody else. They may have the title of chair, there may be a treasurer, there may be a secretary, but overall there's a collective responsibility around the board, and it is that board collectively that has to take responsibility for the decisions that the board takes. And that's a very, very important fundamental in charity law. And then there's a series of legal duties that trustees have to understand and to carry out. There's a number of general duties, and then there's a number of specific duties, which I'm not going to go through just now, but I just wanted to pick out two of the key legal duties, general legal duties that trustees have. Basically, once you sit round that board table, you are acting in the best interest of the charity. You have to make sure that you're acting in the best interest of your charity, and it doesn't matter what else is happening outside. So you may have other things that you're involved with outside, but once you sit around that trustee board, you're acting in the best interest of your charity, and the decisions you make have to be in the best interest of your charity. Alongside that, and this is the one that is so very important for the management of any organisation, you have to act with a level of care and diligence. Now, the important thing about this is it's a level of care and diligence above the level you would expect if you were looking after your own affairs. It's a slightly higher proof. You have to be acting with the care and diligence you would take if you were managing the affairs of somebody else. That does not mean you have to be risk averse, and I think that's something that people get, sometimes a bit tied up about in charities. Sometimes the best thing you can do for your charity is take a calculated risk, but you have to take that risk after having thought through the possibilities, understanding the potential risks, and deciding that it is in the best interest of your charity because you want it to grow, you want it to change, you want it to flourish. Whatever it is, you've got to decide it's in the best interest of your charity as you go along. So these are some very fundamentals, and we can come back to any of this. And I did want to say at the beginning, I've pitched this at a certain level. There may be things that you want to hear much more about. And if so, we can do a future session if that is something that people would be interested in. But I just thought I'd touch on some of the general stuff. So moving on to the next slide. Just going to talk, now we're getting into legal forms. So quite interestingly, a lot of people sometimes think that charity is a legal form. It's not a legal form per se. The status of charity is a badge that sits on top of your organisation, that sits on top of your legal form, as it were. But the legal form is the way that you have been formed as an organisation. I'm going to start off talking about unincorporated charities, generally trusts or unincorporated associations. And I imagine amongst your membership, you probably have quite a lot of unincorporated associations. They'll have a trust deed, they'll have a constitution if they're an unincorporated association. The important thing to understand about unincorporated association is that it works very well for a certain kind of organisation. A group of people get together, they want to do something in their community, they want to do something with a group of people. They get together quite a simple constitution that tells them how they're going to run, how many people they need to make their decisions, and so on. It's quite easy to write, it's quite easy to get going, and they set up their organisation. They become quite successful, it's great, it works for them. The problem, or the potential problem with being unincorporated, is that there's a level of liability that still sits with the trustees. So if you're a trustee of an unincorporated charity, at some level, you're personally liable for what you do. Your charity cannot enter into contracts and so on in its own name because it doesn't have what's called a legal personality. It does not have something that exists in law that allows it to do that. So therefore, it's the trustees themselves who are entering into those kind of relationships. So if you've got a quite small, simple, unincorporated association, doesn't have any land, it doesn't employ any staff, it's got some money, but it doesn't have a massive amount of money, it's got good systems in place, it's got good processes in place, there's absolutely no problem with being unincorporated. But as organisations start to grow, it can become much more complicated. If you start buying land, and I think for sports clubs, that's something that's quite interesting. My local community hub that I'm associated with have got quite a chunk of land. They have quite a number of people who are now employed with them. They have gone from unincorporated to becoming an incorporated organisation in order to limit the liability of their trustees and also just to get some rules about the way that they work, and it just gives a little bit more certainty to them as an organisation. So this is not to say there's something wrong with being unincorporated. For some organisations, it works, and it's the way they've worked for years. It doesn't get in the way of what they do, and they're doing it very successfully. However, the issue of liability, the issue of that lack of legal personality can really get in the way as an organisation begins to grow and get more complicated and enter into much more complicated relationships with staff and with assets and so on. So let's move on to incorporated and what that means. Now, normally, if you're an incorporated charity in Scotland, you will either be a company, normally limited by guarantee, or you'll be a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation. And I'm going to go to those in a bit more detail on the next slide. The important thing about those organisations is that they do have legal personality. So what that means is you are limiting the liability of your trustees if you take on one of these forms. It means it's much easier to have that. It's a clear way of employing staff, delivering your services, owning land, owning property. I think these are the big things that can make people very nervous if you don't have an incorporated structure. It's also true that there are some external pressures on organisations, particularly if they're taking over community assets and so on. There can be a bit of a pressure to say, well, you can no longer do this as an unincorporated body. You need to actually think about incorporating and becoming something that has its own legal personality and can actually therefore limit the liability of your trustees and have a bit more security for yourself as an organisation. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about companies and SCIOs and what might be the advantage and disadvantage of either of those. The truth is that, say, how many years ago now? How long have we had SCIOs? About 12 years ago now? Slightly less. The SCIO did not exist. So the Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation did not exist. It was created by the Act that actually set up the Scottish Charity Regulator, and it was set up as an instrument that was meant to make it easier for organisations, for charities, to become incorporated. Before that, you would have had to be a company. And in a way, in the way that you act, there is very little difference between a company and a SCIO. But when you think about being a SCIO, or when you think about some of the potential advantages of being a SCIO, the idea behind the SCIO and the creation of the SCIO was that you would then only be regulated by one body. It would be a slightly simpler way of becoming incorporated. It'd be quite easy to get sort of model constitutions and so on that you could follow to become a SCIO. And it was just meant to be a simpler instrument for organisations who wanted to become incorporated as charities, but who didn't want to go down the company route. It's been extremely successful. The numbers of SCIOs, the number of new registrations are very much predominantly SCIOs. I think it's 2/3 now of new registrations with us are SCIOs. There are a number of companies that have done the transfer to become a SCIO. It's quite a relatively simple process. And I think it has worked out quite well for some people. There are some slight complications around things like dissolution and so on. And we are actually working on some technical issues around SCIOs at the moment. There's just been a SCIO working group that has finished, has reported, and we will be making some changes to the regulations to try and smooth some of that stuff out. But if I were to say to you what was the real disadvantage of being a SCIO, I think the one thing that it's very important to understand is if you're a SCIO, you only exist if you're a SCIO. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but if you're an organisation who is incorporated as a SCIO, if you decide to no longer be a SCIO, you will not exist as an organisation, which is very different from other organisations. So if you're a company, you can be a company, you become a charity, you don't want to be a charity anymore. You've decided it's not worth it. There's too much to do. You've got to report to that regulator. They're so fussy. They're so annoying. Don't want to be a charity. I don't want to be a charity anymore. You can stop being a charity and continue to be a company. If you're a SCIO, when you stop being a SCIO, you stop being an organisation, which can be, and I'll give you a good case in point around that. We have it will remain nameless what sport it is, but there's an organisation on our register who was an organisation, became a SCIO on the register, and no longer now wants to be a charity, but they want to go back to being the organisation they were before. They would have to absolutely cease to exist, and then probably they could start all over again. But that is a complicated place to get to. So I think if you want to be a SCIO, you have to be making sure your trustees have to be having that discussion, understanding we're putting our eggs in this basket. We're sure we want to be incorporated. This is the form for us. We want to be a charity in Scotland. We want to be a SCIO. We're sticking with that. And then it's a good instrument for you. It can be a good instrument for you. And as we iron out some of the slight technical issues that we've had around it, it will be better and better for organisations. What's the advantages of being a company? Companies have just been going for forever. It's a well set up system. You report to Companies House and you report to us, but we do tend to try to work together so that it's not too much duplication. It can be a good way of being incorporated. So I wouldn't say a SCIO over everything else. Some people have had very successful journeys being companies, limited by guarantee, and being charities, and that's worked well for them. So it shouldn't be discounted as a possibility for you. The SCIO is a great instrument, but there is that drawback of if you stop being a SCIO, you stop being an organisation, which might not be what you would want in the future. So thinking through these things with your charity trustees, talking through them with support organisations or with us or with whoever your fellow peers around the table is a good way of thinking, making sure you've thought through the implications of that. Next slide. I think that might be the end of my slides. Yes, questions. But before we go to questions, just want to say that was a very quick look at this, because I'm assuming that you will have questions or you'll have ideas in your head about the things that you're maybe worried about or concerned about. And as I said, we would be very willing to come back with a much more detailed presentation around any of these things or around additional subjects that would be of interest to you. So I'll stop there. I hope that was okay.
That was wonderful. Thanks very much, Jude. So I know people will have questions, but what we'll probably do, I think, is we'll go straight on to Danny, and then we'll take questions and discussion at the end, because I've no doubt Danny will have reflections from the work that they've done with the Scottish FA that applies across a number of sports as well as just football. So if I can hand straight over to Danny, if that's all right.
Jude, thank you so much for that. I was scribbling notes as you were speaking, so I've got a couple of questions, to be honest, as well. Firstly, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to everybody today. I've done a couple of these presentations over webinars in the last couple of weeks, and I think they're a bit hit and miss. So I've kept the slides, I think, hopefully kind of overarching in terms of our approach more than anything. Again, a couple of disclaimers from my side. This is not legal advice. My company secretary would want me to stress that. From a Scottish FA perspective, all we're just talking about is our approach as a governing body about how we're engaging with clubs. Gregor, that was magnificent in terms of the flow here. You're going to be struggling with me a wee bit more rambling than Jude, so best of luck trying to keep up with the slides. So if you can move on to the next one, please, that would be great. I think first and foremost, from my perspective, I've been working for the Scottish FA for around about 20 years now, in a variety of roles, from football development officer to regional manager, and now to the position I'm in at the moment, which is the club services manager and looking after the club development approach. One of the things I would like to stress, and I know there's a lot of governing bodies in the room, it is an evolution. You know, you're not going to instantly hit the switch in terms of your club engagement and then manage to convince a whole host of organisations who have probably existed longer than you that they need to change the legal status. So I think bear that in mind right from the start. It has to be club-led. Any engagement that we've had that's been successful has been down to the club leading the charge. I think all we can do is offer insight and advice, but it's not down to you as a governing body, I don't think, to make those changes. Every club is going to be different in terms of their circumstances and their motivation, but there are universal learnings. We've understood now that there are, I hate using case studies because not everyone's a case study, it's stories. The stories are the same. You know, a club has different motivations, different pressures, has a different vision, but the process for them to undertake the adoption of a certain legal structure is pretty much the same. So we try and shine a light on those processes. And as I was saying, the motivations can vary wildly. Certainly my job about 10 years ago, every single conversation we had with a club was, oh, we want a 3G pitch. And it almost became, you know, a bit of bingo, where you would say, right, okay, you want a pitch. What have you spoke to local partners? Do you understand the financial landscape? Do you have the membership to back it up? And we were able to go and talk through a process. Now, not every club's going to get a 3G pitch, but what we hopefully did was we left a legacy whereby the club were operating in a slightly different way and probably a more efficient way from our perspective. And then the last one, I think, for governing bodies' perspective, what does success actually look like? Gregor, can you move on to the next slide for me? I usually throw this slide up when we're doing presentations just to show the scale of the game, not to say that, you know, that football is, you know, it feels kind of all-consuming sometimes within, you know, the Scottish landscape, but the one at the bottom is the real crucial one for me. We've got 2,500 clubs, roughly, anything between 2,000 to 2,500 clubs, who vary from the SPFL all the way down to your local amateur club who've maybe got one team. So you can imagine, for me to sit and say what success looks like for that whole spectrum is incredibly difficult. So we as a governing body, we looked primarily at, you know, chunking it up, chunking the pieces of work up to look at the clubs who have maybe got a community impact, the clubs who have, as Jude's pointed out, those charitable outcomes that they're trying to achieve, versus the ones that are undertaking facility development, and we wanted to try and protect them as much as we possibly could. Can you go on to the next one, please? So the tricky part is here, normally it's much better face-to-face and I'm able to get a bit of dialogue with you, but I think context is an important thing as well. So we have 6 regions, slightly different from the Sport Scotland regions, which again has its own difficulties, but these were set up again about 12 years ago. We have a network of regional staff. So we have a club development manager in every region. We have a girls and women's officer, and we have a regional manager. And all of them have slightly different roles in terms of their club engagement part. So, for example, the girls and women's officer might look at participation pathways. The regional manager may look at conversations with chief execs and partnership posts where the club development manager may take them through a process where they've got to try and engage the club structures and try and have interventions all the way through that. As I've pointed out, the spectrum of clubs is really, really huge. And that in itself gives us a real challenge. So workforce, we're never going to have enough staff to cover that. And secondly, clubs engage at different times, as you all know. You know, there are different motivations and different individuals at clubs, so they'll come and go in terms of what that approach looks like. So again, that's a real challenge for us. What I will say though, as a governing body, we've put a real focus on club services, club development for the last 10 years. That, I think, has allowed most of our conversations to be positive with clubs. So if I put on a Scottish FA tracksuit and I go into a club 10 years ago, dare say that instantly there would be a negative reaction, I think, from the individual clubs because we never really spent much time with them. I think that's now changed over a period of time. That's taken time, and it's taken us having, again, small successes and small wins. But the thing that's been underpinning that all the way through is it's reflected in our national strategy. And I know we're here to talk about clubs, but I think that approach to align anything you're doing in any conversation with your staff is really, really vital. Gregor, can you move on, please? So we have our Football for Life. And a wee disclaimer here, I know it's getting recorded, but it was released before the Sport Scotland's Sport for Life strategy, okay, everyone? But the Football for Life really looks at those three key areas. So developing talent, which again is going to be a fundamental part. But the two real crucial areas for me were growing the game in terms of participation numbers and football for social change, which has evolved now into changing lives through sport and physical activity. What we found was that a significant amount of our clubs were solely focused on either developing talent or growing the game. But what we did do over a period of time is after discussions is we found that a lot of the clubs actually do deliver on more and more charitable outcomes. So you can imagine that was a lot of our staff then frantically going on Google, panicking about the legal structures and then saying, right, how do we support the clubs thereafter? So we did have to have a bit of a battle plan when we were going out and speaking to them because, again, this might come in the conversations at the end. I don't know about you, but I think the clubs are more educated than they've ever been before, and the individuals associated with them. And I think it's a real challenge for a governing body because you're asked more and more difficult questions. So we had to rely on a network of people who were educated, far beyond me anyway, and also we were able to underpin it with toolkits and resources to support the ones that we couldn't have a conversation with. Can you move on, please? So how did we do it? Well, 12 years ago, we started a club accreditation scheme. Now, I'm a kind of zealot now when it comes to this. I was not wholly bought into it when we first started the process a long time ago, but we call it a club accreditation scheme, and I think it does it a disservice. It's essentially the ability to speak to clubs and structure your conversations. It's a club engagement tool. The club accreditation programme basically allowed us to sit down and say, right, on pitch, you're doing absolutely fabulously. You've delivered football for the past 40 years and you have a membership of 500 players. Absolutely fantastic. Can you now talk to us about your off-pitch duties? What does your constitution look like? What does your legal structure look like? What's the liability? What's your facility look like? And to be perfectly honest with you, the first couple of times we had those conversations with a lot of clubs, it was like, oh, you're rascal moment. You know, there was no protection and there was no strategic direction about where they were going to. Just down on the bottom of the slides, we talk about the highest level being platinum, which is our legacy group. Now, all of those clubs who have reached that have to demonstrate a more than football approach. So they may do physical activity sessions for older people, but some of them might do breastfeeding classes, some of them may do recreational running classes, some of them may then just do after school provision. And there's a whole plethora of that, of kind of case studies and examples. That for me is the bit that the club structure becomes really, really vital, because you talk about a vision and you talk about values from a club's perspective, and those vision and values have got to be underpinned by the structure of the club, because there's no use having 2 or 3 fantastic people based at the club who are running away doing an amazing amount of work, who are sending in funding applications, if the club's not set up to support those individuals in that general direction of travel. So listening to Jude talk about the creation of the SCO, to hear about, kick for example was seemed fashionable a little while ago. There's a lot of clubs that went down that particular route, and I think clubs maybe, I'm not going to say blindly went down that route, but they certainly probably weren't educated in the long-term effect of going down a particular charitable route or on a corporated route. So that was fundamental for us. The other kind of driving ambition for us was looking at the unincorporated. Protection's absolutely fundamental, and I think actually in light of COVID will be even more important for individuals. So I think we're on the right track as a sector if we're thinking about this to try and support our clubs. Just to give you a bit of an idea, out of those 2,500 clubs, 500 of them, 552, the last count, are quality mark accredited. Probably about 100 of those are legacy clubs. So in terms of my conversation earlier where I was talking about what does success look for us, well, we're able to say that the vast majority of those clubs who have reached legacy or gold level will be incorporated. They will have some kind of charitable outcomes. The legal structures will change and vary depending on whether or not they own a facility, whether or not they're trading, whether or not they're a social enterprise. But we're now more confident than ever that the clubs are operating under the right model for them. And likewise, Jude again referred to this, we've got amateur clubs who will never change and will always just literally be a guy with a bag of balls, and they're just looking after a small group. And it's fine that they're not going through that legal structure process to put any undue pressure on them. We just have to make sure that they're aware of all the ramifications that sit alongside that. So I'm not expecting us to change the legal structure or the club structure of those 2,000 clubs. You can move on, please. That'd be great. So this is quite a lengthy slide in terms of the content, but again, what we had to do is work very hard at trying to create toolkits for our clubs. So this is on the Scottish FA website, and we engaged with a company called Burness Paul. Burness Paul are one of the leading lights in terms of the third sector. They happen to be one of the legal bodies that the Scottish FA work with. So I was very fortunate enough to speak to a gentleman called Stephen Phillips, and Stephen had agreed to kind of pull this content together. Now, again, I'm assuming these slides will be made available for everybody, so you can read through it if you want. I'll be honest with you, I'm a bit romantic when it comes to sport in the country, and I've said this before, and Kim always laughs when I say it, but I genuinely do. I've made the legal structures for your club suitably vague. There's a football club at the front, but all of it inside will apply to any sporting organisation. And I'm keen that if you want, share the document, share it with your governing body, share the document internally, externally with bodies, with other bodies. I'm quite happy that we've spent the time and the resource to go through that with Burness Paul, but this is one of the things that's available for you. And this is the opening spiel within the front page, and it does talk about risk, and it does talk about vision, and it does talk about community empowerment. So that's the main motivation for a lot of the clubs, but that may vary. And Gregor, if you can just take it on to the next one. Again, a busy slide, but this is a snapshot of the different legal entities and what their liability looks like and charitable status, if it's asset locked, etc., etc. Who do you need to speak to in terms of a regulatory body? It's just a very simple tool for us to be able to sit down and speak to a club and say, here's what your ambition is, here's how your structure is currently, and they don't match up. Or if they do, fantastic. And then we can focus on something else in terms of our club development work. Again, that's available for you, so please spread the word and get it out. Gregor, take it on, please. One of the other motivations, so we started a pilot project a few years ago with the National Lottery, and we looked at clubs who were considering community asset transfers. Now again, without crystal ball gazing, community asset transfers for a number of clubs and a number of organisations were a nice to have. And I think that the dialogue that they had with a lot of the local authorities and leisure trusts was pretty varied. What I'm now foreseeing is that due to the current financial situation, I think that asset transfers will become more prominent and they'll become more regularly engaged in terms of a governing body in the conversations with the clubs. Our main fear was that there was a whole host of clubs who put their hand up to take over liabilities and not assets. And because of that, there's a certain legal structure that they have to be, or I think there's 3 of them that they have to be to ensure that they can actually legally go through with that process. We've created a community asset transfers document. Again, it's actually been adopted by a lot of local authorities and leisure trusts. Quite happy for you guys to use it as well in terms of the content. We did it with an organisation called, oh my goodness, I forgot about them. DTAS, who looked at they've got a specific group who look specifically at community asset transfers. So we worked with them to create this toolkit. And again, what we've not tried to do is be too heavy in terms of legal structures conversations. It is about what the vision and values are of the club and how they want to operate. And yes, there's going to be a greater emphasis on them getting to that legal structure eventually, but that process may take a bit of time, but it's well worth clubs undertaking that. And this is just a simple checklist, but I think the document's about 25, 30 pages long, and it's been good for us just in terms of a club engagement tool as well. If you can go on, that would be great. Nearly finished. The opportunity for us to share best practice with other sports has been limited, and that's because I think football for years has been quite inward looking, and we're very, very keen to work with other sports and other governing bodies and other groups to try and showcase that. But what has been successful is we have regional club forums where our biggest clubs sometimes host visits from our clubs, but they also speak to one another on a regular basis as well, and that's been absolutely vital, because it doesn't matter if the governing body tell you to do something. If another club tell you that there's actually been hasn't been a headache and it's been worthwhile, then they're more likely to listen. And I apologise, I'm not telling Granny how to suck eggs, so to speak. That's just through experience, and it continues to be that. There's a huge network available that the sports sector I don't think engage with, particularly around about the third sector. Clubs have got to be aware of what's on their doorstep, and I think governing bodies have got to do the same as well. What does your TSI look like locally? What does your local sports council look like? What pro bono work are you able to get out of various organisations, including businesses? What's available, and if that's something, again, in terms of your workforce that you're not able to support, there are other bodies out there, and we certainly signpost a significant amount of them off to other bodies. The ability to identify the person in the room who's making most eye contact with you, which ironically is something that's really difficult to do right now, but the person who's engaged most is the one that you've then got to try and task with and give structure to and inspire them that this is the right change to make. Because I don't think, again, you can underestimate trying to make a legal structure change for an organisation it's existed for 40 years can sometimes be a literally over my dead body conversation with a lot of people. And I think in Scotland we're brilliant at falling out with one another, and we always remember it. But there are individuals in every single club who I think have got the drive and the time and the headspace to actually take this type of thing on board. So please just work out how to identify them. And that's either in group meetings, or it's in one-on-one, or it's just being able to work out what their skill set is. And I think the club can do that internally, but also governing bodies can help assist with that. And then the final one for me in terms of learning is there is not a silver bullet. There is not one size fits all shape of a legal structure which is going to make sure that your sport is transformed. every community, and this is down to timing, very much so. We'll be reliant on you to steer them in a specific direction. But if you've got organisations like OSCR who are able to give it a bit of advice, then take it, because they're going to know a little bit more than you, or much more than you in my case, and they're also going to be able to talk about, I'm going to use case studies again, damn it, but they're going to be able to talk about other case studies that you can then rely on. Gregor, final slide. Just there, my 3 points that I would like to just talk with you. We've got to do better as a sector to protect our individual clubs and our volunteers and our staff members. And I also want to work out how to better share best practice. And then another thing as well is, in the light of COVID, I would like to understand what your take of the future looks like. You know, how can you help me do my job better with the Scottish FA, and likewise, if we're able to support one another, I think that's absolutely crucial. So that's me. Thank you so much for your time.
Wonderful, thank you, Danny. I'm sure you can all entirely appreciate now why I was quite so delighted to have both Jude and Danny joining us today. So when I said they were experts, I wasn't lying, and Danny, you make a great case study. So thanks for that. I know it's your favourite phrase, so I thought I'll just good stuff. Okay, so I know Danny's posed us some questions as well, which I think is really good. If people are happy with that, I'm going to try and leave that to the end, if that's okay. And we'll certainly open that for conversation, because I think that's incredibly important. Jude, can I maybe just pick up? You'd mentioned, I know that you'd mentioned that one of the main and possibly indeed only challenges at this stage with being a SCIO, for those that have decided that that's the model following the process that Danny's clearly outlined really well, is that you can't stop being a SCIO. But I know you also mentioned that you've got a recent report that will be published quite shortly. So if there are fundamental changes come out as a result of that mean governing or an organisation would want to consider their status, what notification do they get as to those changes, and how material are you expecting those to be?
No, first of all, no. The report, the first report is already out, so that you can get that on our website, and you can also get it on Scottish Government website, I think, because it was a working group for the Scottish Government. The changes will not really mean anything to SCIOs that are existing at the moment, unless what it should do is, if they were suddenly at a stage that they had to stop being, it makes the process clearer and makes the process easier. Because what happened was, when SCIOs were first set up, there was a lot of work done, and then they got to the bit about dissolutions, whatever, and they were running out of time, and they went, this will work for now, and then we can think about it, sort of thing. Not quite, I'm slightly exaggerating. And then it just is a bit clunky, it's not as smooth as it could be, and it's not really very easy either, whether you're solvent or insolvent. So basically what it'll do is make some technical changes, so that if you were to get to that tricky stage where you were going to have to cease to be, it would be easier for you to be able to sort that out without making it so tricky. So that's the main stuff. In terms of the timings of it, of course, what is going to happen at the moment, this was all meant to be happening sort of now, so it's possible that some of it will go into next year's programme in terms of getting it's just regulations, it's not primary legislation, so that might happen, but it could take a bit of time, because we just really don't know the impact of COVID yet on that timetable. But what will happen is, we'll be very transparent about it. We will publicise it quite clearly in our way. We'll send it out to people who sign up to OSCR Reporter and so on, and then also it will be very well publicised by Scottish Government, because that's also part of what they do. But on a day-to-day basis, it shouldn't affect the way a SCIO operates. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jude. Much appreciated. What I'll also just say while I remember is, I've posted the links to the resources Danny talked about in the chat box, so hopefully you can all pick up from there. We'll obviously make sure that they're available as part of the presentation, so when this goes to your clubs, everybody can pick that up as well. So thanks, Danny. They are super resources, and we'll do the same with their presentations as well, so you've got those too. And just for a point of clarity, Jude, in terms of, you talked about charitable purposes identified in the Act. Sport is a charitable purpose as identified within the Act.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. That's why it's quite easy. The challenges with sports clubs are usually around undue restriction, if there is any, or the things. If you have a professional club, for instance, where does that become charitable? Where is it not charitable? So but in terms of the actual activity, it's very automatically charitable, except for, I think there's differences. There's a different interpretation of what sport is in Scotland and England, and I'm trying to remember what the tiny thing is. But for all the clubs that are sitting around your table today, sport is a charitable purpose and is understood as that.
Perfect. Thanks, Jude. Great. So, any questions? Great. We've got a question there. So I think Steph, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry, I had to unmute. We're at an interesting point because we're just a new organisation setting up, and we are going through the whole sort of scratching our heads thinking which is the best structure to get into. So there is obviously limited by guarantee. There are, and then there's this, I guess there's the legal structures, and then there's the charitable, either alongside or independently. But there are other ones that somebody, I think they've been mentioned in this, and it's where does everybody, for instance, limited by guarantee, a community trust or something like that. You know, there's all sorts of other routes to go down. But when you're going through that, the toolkits that you've got, and I think Danny's is a great one that looks like I'll have some time to digest it. But is there other areas that we can sort of think about? Because for me, some of the setting up of whichever one we pick has got to lead towards funding and where we can go and get, grants and whatever. And it's for me, that's the big decision at this point in our lives. And then thinking about the path afterwards, because it may be for the time being one route's right, and later on it is another route. And for me right now, it's like picking our way through that and other people's experience of whatever route you've gone down.
Thanks, Steph. I think that's really important, and certainly I know that one of the reasons that we pulled together the session today was because of exactly that. A number of our members are saying, not only from the incorporation challenges that colleagues have outlined for organisations that do own facilities or do hire staff, is that, as you say, funding is going to be a challenge we expect for everybody as we move forward, and quite often a lot of grants and trust funding is only available to organisations that have a charitable status. So that's very much been in the thinking for today. To Jude and Danny, at Steph's point, obviously there are a myriad, and I know, Danny, you mentioned at one point KICs were quite popular. So KICs are community interest companies, but equally CASCs are, had their day to a degree as well. There are an awful lot more CASCs, so community amateur sports clubs. There are an awful lot more of those down south than there are in Scotland. But are there other models and things that you guys are aware of that would fit neatly into that? Or are we, the best ones of the current models, the ones that we've already discussed?
I think Danny's probably, he's got a great deal of practical experience on the ground. So if I start off and then I'll hand over to Danny to make the answer better. How about that? That'd be great. I think the first thing to say is that it is interesting that the Scottish and the English and Welsh cases are very different, because both KICs and CASCs actually have been, as you say, they had their day in a sense. There was a time where but they seem to have kind of gone off the radar. And there are some funding streams, for instance, that are kind of targeted at those. But certainly in Scotland, many of the major funders and many of the people who are funding certain kinds of activities do tend to hook that on charitable status. Not always, and as I say, there's other ones who recognise other legal forms, and so you cannot be a KIC and a charity, for instance, so that you cannot have a charity status on that. So there's only certain legal forms. They're just independent of that structure because they were meant to sort of fulfill a different function and speak to a different audience and get different kinds of funding. So that's something to think about. But again, if you're very specific kind of sports club and you're aware that, for instance, a CASC has got lots of sources of funding, then that's fine. But I do think you have to bear in mind that in the Scottish context, that charitable badge can be a way of, lottery funding, although they're slightly changing. Lots of the big funds tend to use that as one of their bits of due diligence. So that is interesting. And I would say that there is no, in terms of legal structure, you should probably, at the stage that you're starting off, think about, yes, your future, but also what would be the simplest thing for you to manage in the short to medium term. You don't want to, even with SKIOs, you've got it doesn't, well, we won't go into all the details, but you've got 2-tier and 1-tier scheos. 1-tier scheos are meant to be for very simple structures. 2-tier scheos is when it's a bigger organization. What you don't want to do is to construct something very complicated if you've got a very simple structure. And I think the only way to pick through that is to get somebody in to talk you through the different pros and cons of each one in a very specific way, not just in the general way we're doing today, and to think, well, this would work for you for this instance, this would work for you. And I think that is a good way of having a facility to talk around it, because I think it can feel confusing, but probably once you see what the structure offers you, you'll go, yeah, well, that I understand that now, that makes sense for us. But I pass over to the expert now and let Danny finish it off.
A wonderful double act.
I think that it goes back down to kind of pure club development in terms of what's your approach, or as your body, what is your motivation? So your legal structure should be guided by that. Is it that you want to protect individuals within the committee? Is it that you want to undertake a facility development or protect the facility you currently own? Is it you need gift aid because a lot of your models are based on membership? Your finance models may be based on membership. So in order for you to undertake gift aid, you need certain legal status to be able to then unlock that. And then the last piece is that I understand there are obviously funding pots that are only available to certain structures. However, if you're creating a model just to apply to those funding models, then you're going to find it really, really difficult to go back to OSCR at some point and say, well, we've got all these charitable outcomes, and they go, really, have you? Because it appears to us that you've kind of tried to, you've created your model to go for funding, but it actually doesn't complement about your direction of travel as an organisation. So I think that, and again, that's conversations we've had with clubs in the past. We've said, why don't you just do what you're very good at, look at your future planning, and then we can give you advice on the model that is going to best suit you long term, because funding pots will come and go. And there needs to be more sustainability, I think, in the sector across the board. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Can I just come back in there? Because I think that was a great answer. And I think that it is that understanding that what you want is something that works for you as an organisation and your development path. But it's going to be difficult to know where you are in 25, 30 years' time, but you do have a vision of where you want to get to. And if you could understand that, and then you can get that specific support to help you think through that, that's probably the very best path you can take.
Good stuff. Thank you both. Does that make sense, or is there anything that you want to come back on there?
No, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steph. Good stuff. Any other questions there? Oh, yeah, sorry, Callum.
Hi, Kim. Well, as you know, we are an unincorporated association, and we're operating at a slightly larger scale than common sense would dictate to retain that legal status, to be honest. We were just about, but we're sharing, and so the timing for this input is perfect, to be honest. We were just about to start a conversation about becoming company limited by guarantee. Interesting, the reason we did that, Jane, was that we were told SCIO wasn't open to us. It wasn't suitable because we don't just do sport, we support sporting clubs. So, and likewise, for the wider audience, we're the Police Recreation Association. So the legal definition of our community is quite tight. So that kind of eliminated that as an option. So we're kind of going down the limited company. The SCIO does appeal to me. I've worked in a past life with OSCR. I've always had good relationships with them. They're a good and very helpful organisation. So I'd recommend that to anybody who's listening. But has that changed, Jane? Have I missed that? Or are we bound down the limited company route?
I think that's a great question, Callum, and I think that's open to sort of each organisation themselves that's on the call, as you say, would be relevant. So thanks, that's a great question. Sorry, Jude.
No, I mean, it's a very good question. I think it would seem, and without looking at all the details of what you're talking about, because I would have instantly gone, oh, that's strange. But actually, if you have a restricted pool of people that you can work with, and you have, because associations can be, you don't have to do the sport for it to be a charitable purpose. You can be facilitating other people to do things. But obviously, I imagine you have taken advice on that, and I suggest that it's because you have there's certain restrictions around what it is that you do and how you do it. You'd be welcome to have another conversation with Oscar around that if that would be useful for you, and I would give somebody who is much more on the detail of that kind of area, because very often yes, it can become quite technical. So I think it's probably, if you feel that things haven't changed, so if you've had that advice will still be relevant. But if you feel there's a wee hole there and you're about to have that conversation, it would be worth reinforcing that that's not an option for you, so that you don't go down the wrong path.
Great, that's Callum thanking you. That's super. Maybe just to build on that briefly, Judith, if we can, from a governing body point of view in terms of their own governance structures. So while Callum's, they're quite unique, and obviously being open to the police recreation being quite their specific niche in that sense. If you were one of the other members on the call where you're restricted only by the clubs that want to join and reach, if there are particular standards as required for those sports, how open is the requirement for membership to be? I presume that the idea that there are minimum standards like Danny's outlined for their club accreditation programme, I presume that's okay. How tight are those definitions, I suppose, Jude, please?
Do you mean in terms of whether or not governing bodies can be charities? Is that what you mean? Or do you mean in terms of whether...
In terms of SCIO, so where you're saying you can't be a SCIO if the membership's restricted, obviously governing bodies are promoting good governance, trying to make sure standards are raising... How does that fit as a sort of governing body model for their own organisation?
Yeah, no, it's a good point, because in fact, even though when I talk about restriction, again, when we talk about the charity test and we go out and talk about the charity test, it sounds very clear cut and it's very easy. You just put one cup here, you put one cup here, and you measure them and you've worked it out, because it is about that undue restriction. And very often you can have restrictions in certain organisations if you are targeting particular groups of people, for instance, people with protected characteristics, all that kind of stuff, that you are allowed to restrict around some of these characteristics. If, however, it's meant to be a public participation thing and then you're restricting, that's where it becomes more difficult for you to prove that you're actually contributing to charitable purposes. So it is very much around that stuff. So you will see a lot of organisations who are very much targeted at a particular vulnerable population, and that is fine because it's to do with protected characteristics and so on. But if you are setting yourselves up as a football club that's going to be working in the community, and yet you only take the good football players and you don't take anybody else, then that's starting to be undue restriction. So that's very sort of woolly way of talking about it. But for many clubs, what they do is they have a public facing, they do the public participation, they do that well, but it gives them a chance to bring in the talent as well and train it up. So it's getting that balance right. And when you come to talk to Oscar and whatever, Oscar will check that balance right, because there's been cases, and Danny will probably know, where people have come and where that balance is not quite right, and it becomes a very tricky, well, is that really public participation in sport, or is it actually something else that we're looking at there? So, yeah.
Great, thanks. So it does sound like it's a model that governing bodies could consider themselves if that's useful and relevant. Yeah. While you're thinking of it, if anybody has any other questions, Margarita, can I just come to you very briefly? So across the governing body network, there aren't very many organisations that are charities. So there are a few governing bodies that are charities. There are a few have charitable arms. And obviously have decided, as you say, gone through the process and the rigour that Danny talks about. But Margarita, I think you're the only ones on the call that actually are a charity yourselves. Is there anything you want to input there? Because I know you've seen considerable added value in the work that you've done, and I know how important governance is across inclusive skating.
Yeah, I think I would support very much the approach that Danny's taken, because when I was obviously setting up inclusive skating, I was looking particularly at those people who have got additional needs and challenges and they're being excluded from sport. So the charitable purpose that we're really looking at is relief of need, trying to get people that are excluded from sport by reason of that disadvantage and getting them included. So for us, the long-term development has always been to try to improve access for people with challenges to support. So the funding issues very much flow from that. So I would reiterate what has been said both by Jude and by Danny. You've really got to look at the funding. It's really important, but you've got to have that as your central goal and purpose, that you're actually going to be there for the charitable purpose. That's what drives, like all my activities on a day-to-day basis. So when I was setting up inclusive skating right at the very beginning, for me it was a no-brainer. There was this ideal structure, the SCIO set up. It's very simple, very clear, and it's very helpful if you're wanting to do the charitable purposes. But I think if you're going to try to squash what you're doing into the charitable status just to try to get bits of funding, I think the funders are going to see through it. You know, I don't think you're going to get the money. I think the money will flow from you actually trying to do the charitable purpose properly. So have a very clear vision that what you're actually trying to do is truly charitable, and that the people that are involved in your organisation are truly committed to those charitable activities. And then the funding will flow. You know, yesterday I got £5,000 from the Emergency Response Fund, you know, to support all of our disabled community. And it was very easy for me. I was able to say, look, we've got world rankings that shows their commitment. We take them to these events. I've taken skaters off to the Invitation Games in Sweden in 2 weeks. We're going to try to get all these people now doing off-ice activities. I've got all the research and the data, and it's all about relief of need. So you've got to be honest and true to the commitment of what you're actually wanting to do, and you've got to be truly charitable, is what I would say, if you really want to have the real use and the real benefit from being a charitable organisation.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Margarita. And Margarita is a lawyer in her own right as well, so I've no doubt that you went through more than the required due diligence in all of that. So I'm sure that's helpful.
Well, exactly. And also, I'm a former lecturer as well, so I've actually spent 20 years lecturing on corporate governance and company structures.
So why are we presiding and not you, Margarita?
Exactly.
Like Danny did a very nice document. I strongly recommend you refer to it. It was a really good summary.
Good stuff. There you are.
Can I just come back to that? Because I think that's a great kind of encapsulation of the thing. You don't, you know, being a charitable organisation is all about you offering that, you know, that public benefit and making sure you're not trying to, because where it goes wrong is when people try to squeeze too much into that arm. And very often, I think what you were saying is sometimes charitable arm, but another structure that isn't charitable can work quite well, because you will have activities that are not charitable. I think that's the problem. You have to make sure that everything you do is charitable, and for some organisations like your own, Margarita, that will be true. For others, some of it will be very charitable. Okay, that's your charitable bit, but the other bits will not be. So trying to squeeze things in where they don't fit, it's going to, you might make it work for a little while, but it will fracture because it won't actually fit properly. So I thought that was a great summary of that.
And I think what would be really helpful would be if people were also to think about using the charity as, say, for example, organisations like Tennis Scotland, like the British Tennis Association. They've actually got a charitable organisation that sits alongside. So I think long term it's actually much better, particularly for people with disabilities and challenges, that you think of having a separate charity as an adjunct to do those charitable activities, and that there's very clear then governance by the charity trustees to do the charitable activities and look to the best interests of the charity and the charitable purposes. And it keeps that the risk of conflict of interest down to absolute zero, because you've got individuals doing the charitable purposes and activities. And I find it very easy to do with inclusive skating. And we've got a registration platform that I identify people, and we've got activity groups. So, for example, when I get funding in, I don't actually have like 20 different club structures spread across, Scotland or the UK. I've actually got activity groups, and we actually manage the funds for the activity groups. So that there's ways of using the charitable structure in a more nuanced way that actually makes it more effective, and also ensures that you manage the costs of running a charity. Because a charity, you've got to get the accounts audited. There's quite a lot of work in doing it properly. So you've really got to be, I think, quite careful about how you set it up and how much you expect people at the local level to actually do, and to do it properly and to manage funds correctly.
Thank you, Margarita. Much appreciated. And for some reassurance, if people are considering their own structures, Scottish Disability Sport, probably known to many of you, I would hope, they are a charity themselves, as are Scottish Orienteering. So again, two very different governing bodies that are also charities and have taken that move themselves. So good stuff. I'm conscious that Danny posed us some questions that I am keen to come back to. But does anybody have any other questions on this part at this stage? No, okay. Well, with your grace, I'm going to close this part of the meeting, and then we'll go to a closed Q&A that we won't record in that sense. But can I just, on behalf of you all, thank Danny and Jude enormously for your help. I know that's taken time. I know you're both experts in it, but it still takes your time to come and have those conversations and to start that sharing of best practice that you so rightly talked about, Danny. So I'm enormously grateful. As I say, we are recording this session, and we will share that with you guys, and please feel free to openly share with your clubs. That's exactly the point in this.